Welcome to the University of Uppsala, Sweden, where we are pleased to be hosting the international research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospect of Criticism. The project is conducted in collaboration with the University of Louisville, Kentucky, and is funded by the Templeton Religion Trust as part of their Art Seeking Understanding program. In this seminar, recorded on the 5th of June 2025, we are addressed by Dr. Ryan Doran from the University of Barcelona. Ryan is co-director of the Templeton-funded project Higher Values, based at the University of Cambridge. In his talk, Ryan re-examines George Dickey's criticism of the idea of an aesthetic attitude, arguing that the empirical methods used in the Higher Values project offer some support for the view that our aesthetic experience is characterized by distinctly distant and abstracted kinds of attention.
We've got 1 hour together, and we're really delighted to welcome Ryan Doran back. Ryan feels like a part of the family. Ryan is, of course, also co-director of a project under the same kind of aegis, the Templeton Religion Trust aegis at Cambridge with Simone Schnell, but is also a philosopher based at Barcelona. So you have this dual affiliation, as we can see from the slide. He is talking to us today about the aesthetic state of mind. And I'm going to pass the word to you. And thanks again, Ryan, and thanks everybody for being here. Let's have a nice hour together.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for that lovely introduction, Elizabeth. And it's always a delight to be presenting at Uppsala, albeit virtually. And thanks all for being here. So I'm just going to be talking about the latest research that's come out of our Templeton Religion Trust funded project, the Higher Values project, and that appears in Empirical Studies of the Arts, and it's this paper that you can see on the right hand of the screen. And I thought this would be an interesting paper to talk about because I think it shows us one of the ways in which we might think about aesthetic cognitivism and understanding what aesthetic cognitivism could be. So it'd be perhaps relevant to the Uppsala project. And I think it also might be an example of how we might be able to use the tools of the empirical sciences, the cognitive sciences, to try and make progress in philosophical debates and some of the complexities and the difficulties that can emerge in that context. But just straight off the bat, I want to say this is joint work, and I'm indebted to the fabulous team on the Higher Values project, and particularly the postdocs on the project, who are Jasmina, Elza, and the research assistant, Catherine Simmons. So just to give you a little map of where we're going, I'm going to be talking for about half an hour in total. So first I'm going to talk about philosophical views of the aesthetic state of mind, which you'll all be very familiar with, but I'm going to go through it nonetheless. And then I'm going to talk about the idea that the aesthetic state of mind might be a myth, that objection made famously by George Dickey in the 60s. And then I'm going to talk about one way in which we might try and partially resist Dickey's myth objection by appealing to some resources from contemporary social psychology. And then I'm going to talk about a way that we tested this way of resisting Dickey's myth objection before concluding. So the aesthetic state of mind. So there's a long philosophical tradition which goes back to at least Kant, which tries to characterize the aesthetic state of mind as something distinctive. As something that's different from other kinds of states of mind, of other kinds of ways of engaging with the world. And this has been done in terms of talking about this state of mind as being disinterested or somehow as involving distance. So Kant, of course, in the Third Critique, characterizes judgments of beauty as being made on the basis of pleasure that is disinterested. So the state of mind that is aesthetic here is a certain kind of pleasure, one that is disinterested, where disinterested pleasure is one that doesn't arise from a desire. It doesn't come from desire satisfaction, like eating a really tasty sandwich. The pleasure that comes from that is the satisfaction of your hunger, or may involve the satisfaction of your hunger. And it doesn't give rise to a desire. And when we're making judgments of beauty, we're not concerned with the existence of the object, according to Kant. And the general thrust of what Kant is getting to when he talks about judgments of beauty is, I think, the idea that when we approach the world aesthetically, when we engage the world aesthetically, we just want to savor, we just want to appreciate, we don't want to do anything practical. We don't want to relate the object to our standing interests or desires in any way. Now, a similar idea, but cashed out, I think, differently, comes from Schopenhauer when he talks about the causal state that results from appreciation of beauty. And he suggests that appreciation of beauty causes a pleasant, affective experience, and his account is like Kant in that respect. But his account of that affective state has a richer phenomenology to it. So he says that the state that arises from appreciation of beauty has a phenomenology of release and tranquility. So he says that it involves a kind of felt silencing of one's desires and willing. So here's a nice quote from Schopenhauer. Whenever beauty presents itself to our gaze all at once, it almost always succeeds in snatching us, although only for a few moments, from subjectivity, from the thraldom of the will. The storm of passions, the pressure of desire and fear, the miseries of willing are then at once calmed and appeased in a marvelous way. For at the moment when, torn from the will, we have given ourselves up to the pure will-less knowing, we have stepped into another world, so to speak, where everything that moves our will and thus violently agitates us no longer exists. Now, Edward Buller, appearing here in this charming but slightly haunted photo, takes a slightly different way, or approaches this in a slightly different way from Schopenhauer and Kant. So Buller, in his now very well-known 1912 paper, suggests that appreciation of aesthetic objects involves in some ways what he calls psychical distance. And he characterizes psychical distance as psychologically placing a distance between ourselves and the aesthetic object, where this amounts to putting the object, or putting the world, out of gear with ourselves, where that means putting the world and putting the aesthetic object out of gear with our immediate desires and interests. And he has this lovely example close to the beginning of the paper where he talks about somebody at sea who feels fear in response to some mist descending over the sea, because fear on the sea can mean all kinds of bad things for you, and is able to put that fear at a distance to be able to appreciate the scene aesthetically. So he puts his concerns for his well-being at a distance to be able to engage with the array that appears before him in an aesthetic manner. So I just want to, that's a quick summary of some views of the aesthetic state of mind, but I just want to point to some rough distinctions that we might point to between those different accounts. So if we imagine like time's arrow shooting forward, and imagine an aesthetic encounter happening somewhere in the middle of that, well, we can think of the aesthetic state of mind as occurring upstream of that aesthetic encounter, so in advance of the aesthetic encounter. So we might think along the lines of Buller that the aesthetic state of mind is something like an attitude that one adopts, that we can do this volitionally, we can approach an object in an aesthetic way when we put distance between the object and ourselves and our interests. And it also may happen automatically, but we can think of it happening upstream as an attitude. But we can also think of the aesthetic state of mind in the way that Kant and Schopenhauer talked about it, as occurring downstream of an aesthetic encounter, as something that is caused by engagement with the aesthetic object. And as I just said, Kant thinks about this as a kind of distinctive kind of pleasure, whereas Schopenhauer has a richer conception where it involves a positive, a pleasant affective state, but one which involves some kind of felt diminishing of the self. And that these are caused by engagement with the aesthetic object. And we might also think that there could also be an attitudinal conception of the aesthetic state of mind that occurs downstream too. So although Schopenhauer doesn't say this, you might think that having these kind of affects which are pleasant and which your self is transformed and diminished might also lead to a tendency to distance yourself from the world or diminish your self-interest in a way that becomes like a standing disposition. So you could get something like the kind of affect that Schopenhauer was talking to, causing a kind of distanced or disinterested attitude going forward. So that's just some rough distinctions that we might draw from that overview of the accounts. Now, of course, I think everybody's going to know this idea came under, although it's been very influential, it came under quite vociferous attacks from George Dickey, who was no fan of Kantian aesthetics and no fan of this idea of a disinterested aesthetic state of mind, or even an aesthetic state of mind as a distinctively almost sui generis kind of thing. in and of itself. But in a 1964 paper, he suggested that there's no special distance or disinterested psychological state, and he was mostly focused on psychological distance. So that's what I'm going to focus on here. And in this paper, Dickey suggests that he's not aware of performing any special psychological action when he introspects that could be characterized as something like distancing. He thinks that it's just clearly metaphorical or loose ways of speaking when you talk about distancing yourself in an aesthetic encounter. And I think his most persuasive arguments concern attention. So he suggests that when we're talking in this way about this special aesthetic state of mind that's somehow distanced or involves distance or disinterest, what we're really talking about is just attention. And attention can be distributed to a number of kinds of objects, aesthetic and otherwise, to a greater or lesser extent. And we can explain everything we want to explain everything we want to explain just in terms of attention, and we don't need to appeal to anything like a special aesthetic state of mind that involves distance or even disinterest. And I think the nicest example he gives is an example from Buller, where Buller talks about a man who's watching Othello and finds it difficult to appreciate Othello because he suspects that his wife is being unfaithful to him. And Buller says that this man is underdistanced. He cannot appreciate the play because he hasn't got the right level of distance to the aesthetic object, and so can't appreciate it. And I think pretty compellingly, Dickey comes back and says, no, we don't need to talk about anything about distance here. Get rid of all that rubbish. You don't want to inflate the number of things that we need to talk about here. We can just explain this in terms of attention. What's going on in this case is not that the man is under distance, it's just that his attention is divided. He's partly attending to the fact that he thinks that his wife might have been unfaithful to him, and he's partly attending to the play. He's not fully attending to the play. So you can do everything you need to do just in terms of attention. So that's the starting point for this strand of the work we've been doing on the project. And we think that George Dickey might have been a bit fast, and that we still want to think that there might be a way in which we can hold on to the idea that the aesthetic state of mind might be distinctive in some ways. At least we can partially vindicate that idea, and that it might involve some distance, some notion of distance in an interesting way. I've got motorbikes outside my room. I'm going to just shut them off. The joys of presenting in Barcelona. Sorry. We thought that a theory that's quite a popular theory in social psychology, and which is supported by quite a lot of evidence, might be of use to us in trying to vindicate this disinterested conception of the aesthetic state of mind. And that theory is called the construal level theory of psychological distance. And that theory says that commonly we represent objects in terms of their distance from the experiencing self, and we do this across a number of domains. So most obviously, spatially, when things are here, when they're close to us, we represent them psychologically as being close, and when they're far away from us spatially, we represent them as being distant from us psychologically. Perhaps no surprises there, seems fairly obvious and intuitive, but also that we represent things on other domains as being close or far away from us. So temporally, so when things are in the present, according to this theory and the evidence that supports it, we represent things in the present as being psychologically close to us, and things that are in the future, in the past, we represent as being distant from us on the psychological level. We also do this probabilistically, so things that are certain, the evidence suggests, are represented as being close to us, and things that are far away, are unlikely to happen, are represented as being distant from us psychologically. And there should be one more, sorry, socially. So we tend to think about kin as being close to us on the psychological level, and strangers as being distant from us. So that's the first part of this theory. The second part of this theory is that this representation of distance that we do all the time is happening, that we don't even know that we are representing objects in this way along these dimensions. This distance is represented using a common psychological currency, according to the theory, which is construal level of abstraction. So we represent things as being more concrete or more abstract. That's how we construe things. Now, this is a bit of a Pandora's box philosophically. Whenever this talk is given to philosophers, they do not like how psychologists are understanding abstraction, and I'm happy to get into that. I'm going to largely follow what the psychologists have thought about how abstraction should be understood in this theory. So Roche and colleagues, Eleanor Roche, famous psychologist, understood abstraction in terms of inclusiveness. And Lieberman and Trope, who are two of the prime protagonists in this story, they're the main advocates of the work on the construal level theory of psychological distance. They kind of first launched the theory in the late 90s. They characterize high-level construal in the following way. Whenever we move to a high-level abstract construal, we make a distinction between primary defining features, which are relatively stable and invariant, from secondary features, which may change with changes in context, and, sorry, my thing's in the way, and are hence omitted from the high-level representation. So a rough heuristic, I think, of the way that you can think about construal is to think of the properties that are detected in perception, like shape and color. They're going to be the kind of properties that you would be focusing on or report when you are construing things in a concrete way. And the properties that tend to be detected in cognition, so things like kind properties, function properties, these are the kind of properties that you may be focusing on or report when you are construing in an abstract fashion. Now, so putting those two aspects together, so when things are represented as being closer to you in terms of distance, socially, spatially, temporally, probabilistically, the theory and evidence shows that you will tend to think of those things concretely. You will tend to focus on the details. You'll tend to focus on the secondary details and not the primary details. And you'll tend to focus on the features that you might report or focus on if you were asked how questions about those things. Whereas if you represent things as being far away from you, socially, spatially, temporally, probabilistically, then you're likely to start thinking about those things. You have a tendency to think about those things abstractly. You'll focus on the overall picture. You'll think about the wood rather than the trees. You'll focus on the central features, and you'll focus on the features that you might tend to focus on or report if you were asked why questions about those things. So to try and make this like really concrete, because I've just given you a really quick overview of the theory, and I haven't talked about all the studies that support it. But basically, if I were to give you exactly the same cup and I were to present it really close to you, and I would ask you to describe that cup, you would tend to describe the cup, or you'd have a tendency to describe that cup in terms of its concrete properties when it's close to you. So you might say it's blue and white, you might say it's made of porcelain. Whereas when I present exactly the same cup far away from you and ask you, can you describe that object, you would tend to describe that in terms of its abstract properties. You have a greater tendency to. So you might describe it in terms of its kind properties as being cup and saucer, or in terms of its functional properties as being a receptacle for liquid or an implement for drinking. That's the idea. So how does this help us? Well, we thought that this might provide a way of partially vindicating the aesthetic state of mind from George Dickey's attacks. So we thought that maybe in aesthetic encounters, it could be that either we distance the object from ourselves and in turn our interests. So we represent the object as being more distant from us and our interests, which are going to be related, we think, to our experiential selves. Or that as a result of engaging with the aesthetic objects, as a cause of that, downstream of that, we ourselves get distanced. So we start representing the object in the world as further away from us, and in turn, our interests are going to get disengaged. And since this theory suggests the common currency for distance is abstract thinking, then we're given a hypothesis by which we can test our theory. And the hypothesis is that aesthetic appreciation should lead to a tendency to think abstractly, or should be associated with a tendency to think abstractly, which would indicate that perhaps we're representing some greater distance to the object into the world as a result of our aesthetic encounter. That was our primary hypothesis. We had secondary hypotheses which were related to Schopenhauer. So a secondary hypothesis was that aesthetic appreciation might lead to the kinds of affect in which the self is felt to be pleasantly minimized. If any evidence for that were required, I think probably maybe not, but anyway, perhaps still worth testing. And we're also interested in the idea that there might be a relationship between these two things. So as I suggested earlier, that it might be the case that as a result of feeling these kinds of affects in which the self is felt to be pleasantly minimized, as a result of an aesthetic encounter, that we come to develop more cognitive tendencies to distance ourselves from the world, to distance ourselves from objects, to detach objects from ourselves and from the interests that we hold in any given moment. So this cognitive tendency to think abstractly and represent things as being at a great distance might arise from these affects in which we feel the self is diminished, albeit momentarily. So we wanted to test that idea. So we tried to test it. So we did a study in Kettle's Yard, which is a lovely gallery in Cambridge. And it's actually the home, or the former home, of the Edys. And Jim Edey was a former creator of the Tate. And he used his house to house his private collection and gave people private tours of his private art collection in his house. It's really quite eccentric and wonderful. And we worked with them on a number of studies. So in their exhibition space, they had an exhibition on of Lucy Rees, who's an artistic ceramicist. And we selected 15 of Rees' objects, and we did a study with them in their gallery space. There were two conditions, and I'm going to tell you about the study now. So there was an aesthetic condition and a practical condition. So in the control condition, or the practical condition, that was the baseline that we were comparing the aesthetic condition to. That's the one that half of our participants were in. We gave participants a map of the gallery, and the map of the gallery had numbers on it which indicated where certain objects were. And then participants were given a sheet with line drawings of the object and then a box next to each object. And their task was to walk around the gallery and find the objects depicted on their sheet in the line drawings, and then record where they were in the gallery in the box provided. So basically, it's a practical task. It's a task which requires you to match drawing to object and then say where the location is. And participants in this condition were told to ignore the aesthetics of the objects. They weren't told not to look at the beauty of the objects or pause to look at that. They were just told to focus on the practical task that was in front of them. Whereas participants in the aesthetic condition, the beauty condition, perhaps, as you might guess, were also given this map. And they were given a sheet in which they were told where the objects were, and they were given photographs of the object. And they were asked to visit each object in the gallery on the sheet, and then appreciate the object's beauty if they found it beautiful, and then give a rating for how beautiful the objects were. So that was the design setup of the manipulation. Then we had to give people some measures after they'd done that. And I'm going to talk about the principal ones that we deployed. So to measure construal level, we used the most commonly used measure and the one that's best validated in previous studies. And this is called the behavior identification form. And so it's like 25 descriptions of actions, and each action has two redescriptions. One which is a more abstract redescription and one which is a more concrete redescription. So making a list could be getting organized, or it could be writing things down. And participants are asked to pick the redescription, one of the two redescriptions that fits best for them in that moment. And so voting could be marking a ballot or influencing the election. Locking a door could be putting a key in the lock, or it could be securing the house. Eating could be getting nutrition, or it could be chewing and swallowing. And the more abstract construal in each case is marked with an asterisk. Of course, the participants don't get the asterisks. They don't get told which one's the abstract construal. They're just asked to pick between the two redescriptions. And the abstract construals tend to be the kind of things you might say if you're asked a why question about that action. Why did you make a list? Well, I made a list to get organized. And the concrete construals are the kind of things that you might answer if you're asked how questions. So how did you make a list? Well, I wrote things down. So 25 of those, that's the measure of construal level, and by proxy, a measure of how distanced people were representing the world in relation to themselves in that moment. And then after that, we gave a measure of affective states in response to art. And this measure comes from the great group over in Vienna, Matthew Pawlowski and his colleagues. So a number of affective items that fitted both conditions and that have been commonly reported in aesthetic and art contexts. This was to try to tap into that stuff that Schopenhauer was trying to get at, or was getting at, I should say. And then finally, I'm going to talk about art expertise. So again, from that Vienna group, we thought the expertise might be relevant as to whether people successfully adopted the aesthetic state of mind. So we provided a measure of expertise, which was asked people about how often they visited art museums, how often they read books and articles about art, whether they had any formal training, either in art practice or in art history, and whether they had any hobbies that included art making in any capacity. So 187 participants took part. They were mostly Cambridge University students. They were 22 years old, so quite young. A slight majority of them were women. To avoid self-selection, we tried to recruit a sample we said that the study was about ways of processing information in an art gallery to not give away our hypotheses and not to get self-selection of our participants. But I'm not sure that was terribly successful, as we'll see. So the main results. So what you've got here on the left-hand side of your screen is the amount of abstract thinking that was going on for the subjects in the experimental group. That's the beauty group, the ones who were given the beauty task. And then on the right-hand side of the graph, you've got the amount of abstract thinking, or the number of items that of the abstract construal that were picked by those in the practical task. And what you can see here is that those in the beauty condition, so those participants who were asked to rate the beauty of the objects rather than find the objects, tended to pick more abstract construals of those actions. They tended to be construing in a more abstract way as a result of engaging with the beauty of the objects. And we think that by proxy, since abstract thinking is the currency with which psychological distance is cashed out, that this also indicates that the people in that condition were more distanced from the objects in the world after their engagement with those beautiful objects. There was a wide range of frequency in museum visits, formal training, reading books and articles about art, but interestingly, practicing an art hobby pretty much exactly divided in half in our sample. So 51% of our participants had an art hobby. And so we looked at whether having an art hobby might make a difference to our findings. And so what we did was we did a moderation analysis. And what this moderation analysis revealed was that, yes, having art as a hobby did make a difference. So you've got two lines in the graph here. The lighter grey line is people who did have an art hobby, and the dark grey line is those who didn't have an art hobby. And so what you can see from the light grey line is it's much steeper. And that shows that between the practical condition on the right-hand side and the beauty condition on the left-hand side, there was a big jump up. So for those participants, engaging with beauty versus engaging with the practical task really made them think very abstractly. Whereas looking at the dark grey line, the gradient is really quite slight. So for those participants, being in the practical condition versus being in the beauty condition didn't make so much of a difference to the extent to which they were thinking abstractly and presumably distancing themselves from the world and the objects within it. So this suggests that having art as a hobby, some kind of expertise, is actually relevant to the story here. Then briefly, I'm getting to the end, don't worry. We did a dimension reduction analysis on the effective items. To explain what that is really briefly, basically this is like covariance. So sometimes you want to measure psychological states that you can't measure with individual items. You have to use a range of individual items to kind of get vaguely at that underlying psychological state. And so what you can do is you can look at which items cluster together to give you some indication of whether there might be a single underlying state that's driving responses to those individual items. And we found that there was evidence of covariance that would suggest that there was two kind of underlying states that was going on in participants. A positive affect with high arousal. So this was a state that tended to be indicated by participants' responses to the happy, excited, stimulated, absorbed, and interested items. So those items tended to go together in participants. And then there was another factor or underlying state that seemed to be present in our participants' responses, which we call transformative and self-transcendent affect based on some findings in psychology. And this state seemed to be indicated by the items enlightened, moved, and transformed. And what we found was that participants in the beauty condition reported more of those transformative and self-transcendent affect than participants in the practical condition. But the participants in the practical condition and the beauty condition experienced exactly the same amount of positive affect generally. So this first kind of affect, this general positive affect, both conditions felt that equally. So whether you were doing the practical task or whether you were doing the beauty task, you felt the same amount of positive affect with high arousal. But if you were in the beauty condition, in addition to feeling that positive affect, you tended to feel something that was a little bit more transformative, a little bit sort of more peaky, something that was more transformative and self-transcendent in some ways. Now, what we wanted to do, as I mentioned earlier, was to look at whether those kind of self-transformative and self-transcendent aspects might play a role in giving rise to that abstract thinking, in giving rise to that distant state of mind where you're putting distance between yourself and the world. So we wanted to know whether those affects in which the self is diminished or transformed in some way, might mediate the effect of our manipulation with beauty on abstract thinking and in turn psychological distance. So we did a mediation analysis and that did not confirm this. So what that tells us is that the beauty was making people think more abstractly, especially if they had an art hobby. And the beauty was also making people feel more of this transformative or self-transcendent affect. But those two things were basically happening in parallel. One wasn't causing the other. The positive affect there, the self-transcendent and transformative affect, wasn't causing the abstract thinking. They were two independent processes that were happening in people's minds. So what's the philosophical significance of this? This is my last slide. Well, the philosophical significance of this is that Dickey might not be quite right, we don't think. That the aesthetic state of mind might exist, or it might be able to be partially vindicated, and that it might be able to be characterized in terms of disinterest and distance, after all. And that it can't be reduced, I don't think, to mere attention, even though attention is likely to be part of the story here, because it can be characterized, according to these results, at least in part, by a tendency to think abstractly. And if that's a common currency for psychological distance, it can also be characterized in part in terms of this construct of psychological distance as it's postulated by modern social psychology. These results also suggest this is not the result of self-transcendent and self-transformative affects that appreciation of beauty also tends to give rise to. So it looks like it might be a kind of standing cognitive disposition. So that can help us to sort of disentangle some of those distinctions that I was pointing to earlier on between upstream, downstream, affect, cognitive state and the relationships between them, although there's a lot more work to be done there. And our results also suggest that our hunch that this is something that might be, that aesthetic appreciation might be something skill-like that requires expertise, looks like it might be along the right tracks as well here. That approaching the world aesthetically might be skill-like and might require some practice with the arts. So it's important to emphasize that this might be a partial vindication. There's only one piece of evidence, but I think it's important to stress it's not going to give us a sui generis aesthetic state of mind, because distance is a pretty much ubiquitous feature of our psychology, according to these psychologists. So when you're thinking about your kin versus strangers, events in the past versus events in the present, you're already going to be representing them on the psychological level as being further or closer to you. So psychological distance is ubiquitous. So it's not going to give us a sui generis aesthetic state of mind, but at least it could be part of a story of what's distinctive about at least some aesthetic ways of engaging with the world. And that's it. Thanks for listening.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ryan, for a great talk. We have 25 minutes for
run over.
discussion. Don't worry. I think that's really the perfect amount. Thanks so much. We have a question already. Edgar.
Thanks a lot for this amazing talk. I just have a question on the potential bias that is implied in the study, in the sense that in what sense it is the experience of beauty that induce thinking abstractly and not the experience of judging whether something is beautiful and rating something, which is already something more abstract and probably different from just experiencing something as beautiful. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. That's interesting. So in a way, my intuition kind of goes the other way. I mean, if you think of beauty as being something like something that's analogous at least to sensory properties, you might, or something that supervenes on, or paradigmatically supervenes on sensory properties, you think it might be quite close to actually low-level construals, to those properties that you're going to be reporting on low-level construals. So I'm not sure whether my intuitions are not so clear that making a judgment of beauty should be a more abstract judgment than, say, judging a location of an object in a gallery. Definitely, it seems like it's at one level removed from the sensory properties on which it paradigmatically is going to supervene, right? But is that more abstract? That we've already got into the discussion about what abstract is. Is that more abstract than recording where something is in a gallery? I'm not sure. Yeah. But maybe you could say more about why you think that the experience might be result in less abstract construals than the judgment per se. Is it because the judgment involves a concept?
Yeah, I don't want to take the whole discussion, but for me, if I were to rate something in a museum, it wouldn't be exactly an aesthetic experience. It would be something else, more about judgment and it would be a difficult intellectual task just to rate things. I don't think it would eventually be aesthetical just to rate things. But anyway, that's just my intuition on this.
Yeah, thanks. So to be entirely honest with you, this is we did various designs to try and get this to try and test this hypothesis. So I spent a lot of my postdocing years at Cambridge trying different things. So some of the designs we did were where we gave people images of furniture and we either asked them to judge the practical utility of those pieces of furniture versus the beauty of them. I also designed a study where we gave people images of food and we asked them to rate, in one condition, the tastiness of the food or how much they wanted to eat the food versus how beautiful the food looks, to try and control for the idea that they both need to make a judgment in the two conditions. But in one condition, we want to be getting at that kind of practical engagement with the world. And in the other case, we want to really be tapping into that distinctively aesthetic, standing back, savoring, not wanting to engage any kind of practical any actions towards the object. Our results there were actually a bit mixed. Sometimes it worked. It seems as if like individual difference variables between people might be really important. But also in all of those tasks, it seemed like they were still judging pictures, right? They were still somehow one step removed from the reality, which is not really what some of the theory predicts. The philosophical theory that talks about, practical engagement as being the thing that aesthetic appreciation is contrasted with. And in those kind of tasks, you've still got something that looks contemplative and not fully practical. It doesn't involve action in the same way. It's not like I've given people a plate of food and say, hey, eat this food and tell me how tasty it is, how much you want to eat it. Versus just look at it and tell me how beautiful it is. So yeah, I take the point about judgment. Maybe that's something that would ideally be controlled between the two conditions. So yeah, thanks for that.
Great, thank you. And as much as I love watching this bowl and appreciate the Swedish version of the thank you, perhaps we could stop the screen share and then might facilitate discussion a little bit. Thank you so much, Ryan. Thank you. And our next question, Victor, nice to see you.
Very nice to see you all. Ryan, thank you so much for the talk. And I want to say from the outset that I'm very positive about the project. I do admire these kind of projects in the tradition of Exfil. So even if my comment is going to sound a little bit critical, I'm really, really happy with what you are doing, and I admire the ingenuity and the courage that it takes to set up this kind of experimental project. My constructive, hopefully constructive suggestion is the following. I am not sure that you are doing yourself any favors by going through this kind of historical conceptual framing of the project. I was particularly uneasy about the sliding from distance to disinterest. And I worry that this is going to muddle things in a way that is going to shortchange and weaken the project that is very exciting as it is. So you were talking about the Dickey-Stolnitz debate coming from the huge influence of Kantian and Schopenhauerian aesthetics in the 1950s, 1960s in the Anglophone world. When you move forward to the early 2000s, when Noel Carroll is playing Dickey to Robert Stecker's Stolnitz, and not just Robert Stecker's, but also people like Iseminger. Basically, the signposts have moved. And now what someone like Stecker would be defending is that you have intrinsic value or value for its own sake as a necessary condition, simultaneously with instrumental or extrinsic value. And what someone like Noel Carroll would be defending is that, no, you don't need that. You could have an aesthetic experience purely on instrumental value, okay? And the very precise question that I want to put to you is that even in that we can no longer Kantian in the strict sense way of framing matters, you could have someone, I'm thinking of Guy, so think of someone who is a conductor, okay? A conductor who can distance themselves very, very much, who can abstract a lot, and yet that abstraction is motivated and is giving rise to interest in the classical Kantian sense, valuing matters for their own sake, connected to instrumental appreciation, okay? So if it is possible to actually buy the idea of abstraction and yet hold on to some version of either classical interest in the Kantian sense, or in the more modern currency, instrumental value connected to intrinsic value, to what extent do you want to keep the connection between disinterest and distance? And wouldn't it be better to just stay with distance, forget about the whole Kantian Schopenhauerian inheritance, and just focus on more contemporary terms on what is coming out of your research? So hopefully that has sounded constructive and supportive enough, but those are my 2 cents.
Yeah,
Otherwise, congratulations on the project.
Thanks very much. Thanks for the constructive comment. I agree. I think really the project is really trying to help out Buller, who, I don't think people really talk about distance, as you say. The debate kind of moved on. Think about Stolnitz and Stecker talking about, as you say, intrinsic value as a necessary condition. Stolnitz still talks about an aesthetic attitude, and I think he was a target of the kind of thing that George Dickey was aiming at. But I think you're absolutely right. I don't think that there's necessarily a tight connection. There's a tight connection. I think there's some connection between disinterest and distance, maybe on the psychological level. But conceptually, yeah, I think it's clear they can come apart. So yeah, I think I'm broadly, I'm in agreement. I think I was motivating the story of where Buller had come from. I'm not sure I quite got the details of the example with the conductor and instrumental value.
So very, very briefly, because I don't want to take up any more time, the idea that you could be distancing and thinking abstractly, and yet being very interested in the Kantian sense, because you have an instrumental interest, for instance, if you're in your abstract thinking about scores or conducting or whatever. That's what I meant.
Right.
Ryan, we can continue this over email. I'm really conscious that we have only 15 minutes.
I'm just brief. I'm thinking that Kant might be able. I could say, on Kant's behalf here. Well, there can be an interest here. It just doesn't need to be the interest which is grounding the that's involved aesthetically here, right? That could be something separate, but it's not going to be an aesthetic kind of response to the extent that it involves.
Okay, but that would be a very marked departure of how many people understand Kant in that respect.
Thank you both. Next question comes from Guy.
Thanks very much. I don't know if I have to declare my Kantian interest at this point, but it was a super exciting talk and really just really helpful for us. So thank you so much for sharing this with us. So I just speaking for Dickie briefly, which is not something I've done very often, just wonder to what extent his idea of attention being the kind of like psychological mode that captures everything that he thought came under kind of normal attention and the aesthetic attitude. Whether there's anything in his model that wouldn't account for attending to the abstract aspect of things as well as to the concrete aspect of things. So I agree what you're doing is kind of like giving scientific credibility back to Bullo, and I think that's I don't know if you can say QED at that point, but it's like that's very convincing. But whether that undermines Dickie's argument is another question, I think. But one thing I did thought, if I can just add on a thought to that, which is that the model of moving between the abstract and the concrete, and your representation of that with a brilliant diagram of the teacup, actually put me in mind of a related but quite different kind of philosophical psychological theory, which is Volham's theory of two-foldedness, that you kind of like imply in any extended artistic engagement or aesthetic engagement, basically a cooperation between details of the abstract level which make sense of what's on the surface level and details of the surface level which then help you kind of organize the abstract level in a certain sense. And you have this, I mean, he doesn't describe it as an oscillation, but if you imagine that somebody who is treating the teacup as a work of art, that you are having an oscillation between the two, because as Kant would say, you don't have a concept of what it is that you're what the thing in itself is. So yeah, the main thing is like Dickie's attention. Does that not also track abstract and concrete? And what about testing Volham?
So really quickly on the second point, I'm going to take first. That's really nice, and we had actually talked about whether really this generalized to all kinds of aesthetic appreciation. So you might think that there are certain kinds of artworks where you actually need to attend, as you say, oscillate between the concrete and the abstract in order to get an appreciation. So think of things like works of pointillism, where you need to appreciate how the artwork is made up of tiny dots in order to appreciate some of the effects, just to give an example. Or photorealistic paintings, where you really need to appreciate the fact that that's really art, that's done with a paintbrush in order to appreciate some of the aesthetic effects. I mean, those are just two examples. So absolutely, maybe this doesn't generalize fully, and yeah, that point is really well taken. On the Dickie point, I see where you're going. So it could be that, look, you say, well, okay, we're psychologically distanced, but that just means that when we have an aesthetic encounter, when we approach an object aesthetically, or the consequences of an aesthetic encounter, that we're attending now to abstract features. So it's still attentional, right? It's still, you're just attending to the abstract features, not the concrete ones. But I do think there is a difference. So in the case of, for example, Othello, it's not that the man who thinks his wife is cheating is attending abstractly now to the work of art. He's partly attending to the fact that he thinks his wife is having an affair. So in that case, Dickie's explanation is that the attention is divided, not that someone's thinking in a different way as a result of their engagement. So I don't think that Dickie's going to be able to, I mean, maybe you could modify what he says about attention, but I think it's going to become much richer than at least than what Dickie had suggested. Yeah, that
really clarifies exactly my point. So thank you. Perfect.
Yeah, very interesting. Thank you, John.
Yeah, that was superb. And it's really interesting for the work we're doing. So I'm going to try to make this question intelligible in less than a minute. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to. What I found really interesting is the way you linked on near the beginning of the talk, the asking of certain why questions that become intelligible when you move up this level of abstraction. And I think that's really important for cognitivism because the kinds of moral, social, political, critical values we ascribe to art very often are not reducible to anything you're going to encounter on the perceptual or semantic surfaces. There has to be, to use, go back to Volheim, some seeing in or some moving up and seeing more in a work of art than is available to mere perception or semantic understanding. I'll give a really silly example. Like if I write a perfectly clear email with instructions to a funeral, and you respond to that by saying, what does this mean? I'll think you either don't know English, or you didn't know you were invited, or you didn't know the person had died. If the same content appears in a poem, it makes perfect sense to ask that. And what you're doing is asking, you're trying to understand how the role of that content in the poem, or more interesting for cognitivism, the comment it's trying to make, the insight it's trying to lodge about the course of human life. What this line of thinking sort of encourages, this abstraction and the way it makes relevant the asking of certain critically essential why questions, there's just the properties of works of art, the forms of meaning or value, we're just not going to see if we don't engage in this moving up various levels of abstraction. So it invites certain interesting ideas. Like, is it required? It's not just mere appreciation where we take in more detail. It's seeing in or making available regions of a work of art and their meaning that without this attitude are simply unavailable to understanding and perception. Does that make sense?
Oh, it absolutely makes sense.
Okay.
Thanks. I was going to say, I think you're pointing to something pretty interesting, which is, like often with expertise, we get access to the more interesting features of a work, which often concern those high-level properties you're talking about: social context, political context. What does the work mean? And so you might be tempted to say, well, look, maybe our findings just, especially since the findings, the effects tended to be particularly there for people with an art hobby, maybe these people are just more well-practiced at trying to look for exactly those higher meanings by treating those works as being richer on that level. I think one thing that, and I think that's true, I think that could be true in lots of cases, but I'm not sure whether it would be true in the case of the ceramics, because these look like purely formal objects, right? An alternative explanation is you might say, well, look, beauty looks like a property that's somehow uniformity and variety, and so to successfully appreciate beauty, you've got to find the elements somehow coming together, and that's why you get abstract thinking in this case. Those subjects who are asked to appreciate the beauty are kind of doing some kind of unification, and that's why they're thinking in an abstract way. So in this case, I'm not sure that the meaning, maybe it does, maybe I just don't know enough about her ceramics to know where the meaning would be derived from. But I think definitely in other cases, that's exactly right. And that may indicate exactly the kind of thing we do when we require expertise in the arts.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great. Thank you both. Tsaki.
I can't hear you, Tsaki. No.
Try again, please. Maybe the volume button, because you don't seem to be muted.
Could you perhaps write it in the chat, Zaki?
Maybe something.
I think there's a problem with the audio.
Maybe
How about now? Can you hear me now?
Oh, yeah. No, good.
Okay, so I switched from the good mic to the lousy one. Anyway, I have loads of good things to say about your presentation, but I'll get to the question fast. So I'm asking about the normative versus descriptive distinction in relation to this entire discussion. So you're basically checking what people are actually doing in a museum setting by giving them a task, And one aspect of this entire debate would be to say, look, it's not about how people actually respond, it's about guiding them to how they should respond to art. And this goes back to Guy's point about the concreteness dimension of all this. It seems to me that when people engage well with art, they engage extremely concretely. It's about a way in which a certain patch of color in a painting works, and people can discuss. People can discuss that for 20 or 25 minutes about the way in which a certain hue is achieved. And that becomes extremely, extremely concrete. And then it wouldn't be right to expect them to go for abstractions. Actually, if they go for abstractions, they're doing things wrong. So if you can respond to that. And thanks again for this talk.
Yeah, I take the point. I think it's yeah, it's a well made. I think that you're right, and this kind of brings back a lot of what's been said about oscillating between very low level features of, say, a painting and high level features. How effects are achieved by an artist, and that's what can be involved in appreciating a work. Often it is involved in what's involved in appreciating work. So I take that point. Yeah, yeah. I wonder whether this is something which could be tested in another context. Whether concrete construals indicate success. My feeling is that concrete construals are not going to indicate success, but rather maybe more of an oscillation might indicate success. So it'd be interesting to do something where you're able to measure in real time how much people are construing and how much they flip. And my sense is that experts in art appreciation would be doing more of the flipping between the two, as opposed to arriving at overall a concrete construal in the end. But yeah, I think it's a really great point and well made. I take that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to just squeeze in a small observational comment, perhaps, before and coming from a slightly different angle. I mean, I know this also picks up on something that's difficult to put into words, but that worries me probably just as much as you. And it was just the way when we were talking about, being an experience of this kind of being self-transformative and leading to this kind of transcendence. And of course, we want to try to put our finger a little bit more on what that could possibly mean, right? Or what that could be. But am I right in thinking that some of the descriptions you were giving us were more congenial to the kind of transformative point, which is difficult to explain, whereas it might not be more natural to think of this discussion putting the weight more on the transcendence point, not because it's so much more obvious what that is, but that there is at least some kind of a shift, a movement. Isn't there some sense in which we are, distancing or creating some kind of distance already when we are transcending something? So maybe that's the more kind of obvious partner here. I don't know. It's a really difficult nut to crack, but if you could say something about it.
You're absolutely right. I think the more natural one that goes with distance is going to be self-transcendence. And actually, all the early papers on the construal level theory of psychological distance, the main papers are actually called Transcending the Here and Now. And they actually talk about the psychology of everyday transcendence that we're doing all the time. So it very naturally fits with self-transcendence. And interestingly, I don't think our results actually supported so much the self-transcendence claim as opposed to the transformation claim, because the items that we tended to get coming from the beauty condition were things like feeling enlightened. And feeling enlightened looks like it's more of a self-transformation than it is a self-transcendence. So maybe that claim is actually on less good grounds from what we've found in this study, at least. But I think you're absolutely right. It's the close link is going to be between those self-transcendent states and distance than it is between self-transformation, for sure.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. Let's thank Ryan one more time. Thanks for your questions. Plenty of things to think about and discuss further. This was actually the last Zoom seminar for our project for this academic year. But we'll keep you posted about what we'll be planning for next year. And we want to thank you all for participating and pushing this project forward and being part of it. So thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everybody's here, and more after a well-deserved summer break.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care, everybody.
Ryan, thank you. That was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this recorded seminar from the research project Aesthetic Cognitivism and the Prospects of Criticism. To find out more about the project, please go to our website www.aestheticcognitivism.com.